the stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. Welcome to Garage to Stadium. Today's episode is the story of Bruce Springsteen. Bruce was born in a small industrial town called Freehold, New Jersey, about 40 miles from Newark, New Jersey, and about an hour or so from New York City. What you're about to hear in this episode is an incredible story of how a small town boy with extremely challenging family circumstances went on to become a global superstar. Springsteen has been called a street poet for his uncanny and rare ability to chronicle in his songs the everyday person in their pursuits, frustrations, desperation, hopes, and dreams. Bruce became a touchstone with his poignant songs that struck a chord with an audience looking for the meaning of it all in the mid to late 70s and early 80s. And he's continued into the 2000s, writing from the perspective of the everyday person. Songs like Born to Run, Thunder Road, Promised Land, Hungry Heart are like mini movies that put you squarely inside the main character's mind as they navigate life. Bruce, or the Boss as he is often known, has achieved 140 million albums sold, several top 10 hits, Grammys, Oscars, and even a Presidential Medal of Honor. Today's guest to discuss Bruce is Peter Ames Carlin, a journalist, critic, and author. Previously a senior writer at People magazine, his work has been published in the New York Times Magazine, the Los Angeles Times Magazine, and the Times in the UK. He's authored books on Paul Simon, Paul McCartney, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, and a forthcoming book on the band REM called The Name of This Band is REM. Peter wrote the New York Times bestseller called Bruce and is working on an upcoming book on the 50th anniversary of Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run album. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums, Peter.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
For those who've not seen Bruce in concert, tell us, Peter, from your perspective, what is so special about his performances?
I've been following his work since I was 15. I was like a sophomore in high school in 1978 when I first saw him play. And, which was, a real eye opener, and kind of, people always go, oh, life changing. And which is, biting off a lot, but it was like an indicator to me that there was something. It wasn't just him as much as, obviously he was great, and what he put into a rock performance was so different and so much more powerful and meaningful. Even as a high school sophomore, it's like I could tell that something different was going on here, but it was just on a different level.
Peter, a lot of books on rock stars are unauthorized. They don't have access to the person in question. Yours was different. Tell us about how this came about.
I've written a bunch of those books, those the ones where you don't get cooperation officially. And sometimes, often that isn't a bad way to go. In this case, I started out and I didn't have any cooperation from those guys for the first year and a half or so. I just started doing the research that you do. I went back to his hometown in Freehold, New Jersey. I went to Asbury Park. I just began to, call people up and get in touch and talk with people. And that went on for a year and a half.
And I understand that John Landau, Bruce's longtime manager, became aware that you were talking to people in Bruce's network.
John Landau told me later, he said, did you think I wasn't watching you? And I was like, gee, and from that point forward, he was very cooperative at first, and he was just opening all the doors and getting me everything I wanted to see. But then, Bruce began to let me see all these other, these people who were getting closer and closer, and finally, like one of his sisters, and then his other sister, and then his mom.
So what was it like to sit with Bruce?
It was complicated. The thing about interviewing Bruce, which is interesting, is that he's so smart that you can see his brain spinning, because I'd ask him a question and I could see him not only considering that question, but also considering what I might ask, like 3 questions, like where I was going. Mm-hmm. And so then it was a little like playing 3-dimensional chess, because there was a lot of I'm going to say this, but I mean that. And I'm trying to take you over there. And he'd hear a question and go, you said that, but what you mean is this. And also you want to take me over, so then he's like it wasn't like it was ever antagonistic in any way, but there were certain things that are like, he's less comfortable talking about. And my job as a reporter was to make him talk about stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
not to gotcha or to make him uncomfortable, but because this is like the interesting stuff.
Right.
And so it was, interesting, complicated, fun.
So we'll get more into Bruce's personality in a bit, but I think to get there, let's go back and his family life. He's like a portrait of American melting pot. He's got Dutch, Irish, Italian roots, but beneath it is a really kind of crazy story that you illuminate very well in that book, involving grandparents, parents, lots of dysfunction.
Well, he was born September 23rd, 1949. In a very blue collar, working class, kind of lower working class family. His dad and mom, Douglas Springsteen and Adele, formerly Zerilli, she's the Italian half, were living in this little sort of industrial town in central New Jersey called Freehold, which was at that time sort of governed mostly by this, certainly economically, by this big Karagusian rug factory. A lot of people worked there, but there was also a Nestle factory. It was a very industrial type of thing.
Yeah.
And his mom worked as a legal secretary and was very sort of charismatic and energetic and fun. And his dad, Douglas Springsteen, was a World War II veteran and came from a family that was very old. That went back, to I think it was Justin Springsteen. Emigrated to the United States from Holland in like the 17th century or something. So they'd been there a long time. But there was a certain, there were Irish people involved in the family.
And you write, Peter, that there was some very dark issues in the Springsteen family as well.
There was just a darkness that kind of sifted down through the generations, and also a certain amount of psychiatric dysfunction. And his dad was a very hardworking guy, a very, very gentle person in a lot of ways, very large, a big guy, burly worker type of guy. But he also had, was bipolar. And so would have these episodes and sometimes be very manic and kind of, crazy, to use a lay term, crazy, and sometimes very down. And, his demons were very much in control of his, sort of emotional tides. And so it was really difficult for him to hold a job, even though he was a really hard worker and tried really, really hard. And he kind of would go from job to job. And, he wasn't helped by the fact that like there was, by the sort of the collapse of the industrial middle class. But Bruce grew up in this family that was very sort of governed by some dark experiences. His dad's older sister, Virginia Springsteen, was killed in basically run over by a truck when she was, I think, 5 years old. And that really destroyed their parents. And so when, Douglas was being raised by his family, there was just a lot of strangeness and just a lot of unresolved, tragic feelings.
Yeah.
And so by the time Bruce was born, and then his parents ended up moving in with the grandparents, they treated him like this sort of second coming of, he was the first new life in their family since the daughter was killed. And there was a certain sort of, worship, sort of hero worship that they had for him from the time he was old enough to walk, where the sun seemed to rise and fall over little Brucey, which was terrific for him, but his parents were a little displaced. And so those relationships were very strange. And he sort of grew up sort of on the one hand, feeling like a sun god. And on the other hand, knowing that his family was very out of step with the community and poorer than most people, and also sort of strange. And so he grew up sort of simultaneously as this sort of brilliant creature, but on the other hand, also an outcast. And
Mm-hmm.
it was sort of that combination of factors that really sort of fed into his artistry and his sense of, when he began to, to listen to rock and roll and want to be a rock and roll performer. What mattered to him, and to a large extent, was that sense of exceptionalism. He really wanted to sort of rekindle that.
Yeah. You tell some really sad stories in that book of him being alone in the schoolyard and not being included. His
Mm-hmm.
dad every night would sit in the dark in the kitchen,
Mm-hmm.
drinking a 6-pack, like literally every night,
Mm-hmm.
sit in the dark by himself. And, just this intimidating kind of presence in the house.
Mm-hmm.
And it really paints the picture of some of the complexity that Bruce comes from.
Yeah, it was rough, because his dad in the kitchen there is just basically fighting off his demons,
Right.
which were like coming to him like on a daily basis. That scene that you described in the dark kitchen by himself, smoking cigarettes and drinking beer until he was sleepy and, tired enough to go to sleep.
Mm-hmm. So, turning to the musical influences, because we got to get there eventually. The his mother is, the seminal moment. His mother buys the guitar that Bruce begs for when he sees it in the store window. What were some of Bruce's early kind of influences?
Well, I mean, first, that great big boom, big boom, big bang moment of seeing Elvis on TV. It wasn't Elvis's first appearance, but second or third, one of the early TV appearances, and suddenly there's Elvis. And as Bruce has said, it was the arrival of a new kind of man. It's like all the rules were done. Like everything you were supposed to be, Elvis was not. And yet he was driving people insane and they loved him, and that's all Bruce needed to know, really, because he was different and he
Yeah.
felt he sort of, on the one hand, was an outcast, but on the other hand was kind of extraordinary. So he was like, that's who I want to be. So he started, he wanted a guitar and I think they rented him one and he was trying to play it, but it was a lousy guitar and he had little hands and he couldn't make it go. So he put it away and then, was listening to the type of music you would listen to in those days. His mom was an AM radio head, so they listened to the top 40 in his kitchen in the mornings. But then it was the Beatles on Ed Sullivan in 1964 when he was, 15. And that was the next one where he was like, now I really got to get a guitar, at which point he was old enough to actually figure out how to play. And as he said, the moment he, looked in the mirror and saw himself standing with a guitar, it was the first time he could really stand who he was. And that was a powerful moment. And from that point forward, it's all those great, 60s bands, the Beatles and the Stones and the Byrds and all those people. And, and that's what swept him up. And, by 1965, he was in a band of his own, the Castiles, and and they started playing and being fairly successful on the kind of teen club circuit by 65, 66.
And then it's, I guess from there he goes on to a band called Steel Mill, and I've listened to some of their tunes. That is a heavy, heavy sound, quite different than the familiar Bruce sound.
Yeah, it was kind of proto-metal, like they came together, I think, in the January of 69. They were called Child at first, but then it turned out there was another band called Child, I think, from Long Island. So they reconfigured themselves as Steel Mill, and they were just like a power quartet, because it was Bruce. And at the time, Bruce was best known as a lead guitar player. Like he was extraordinarily fast and melodic and just, extremely gifted as a lead guitarist. And he would write these songs that were essentially just delivery systems for these incredibly epic solos that he would take.
Right.
So he was playing the lead guitar, and then Danny Federici, who went on to, obviously to be in the E Street Band, played organ in that very sort of the very active, very sort of aggressive on the keys in that kind of late 60s-ish way. and they would play these incredibly long songs that, you know, sort of revolved around these huge guitar breaks. And they were very popular around New Jersey. I mean, they were clever about how they booked themselves. They would only play, you know, instead of playing tons of club shows all the time, you know, for a few bucks here and there, they would play like once a month, but play like a big outdoor show somewhere and
Yeah.
charge everyone $1 to get in. And you get like 2,000 or 3,000 people. That's more than you know, what you need to live for a month in 1970 in, you know, in central New Jersey when you're a 20-year-old.
I mean, they actually opened up for Allman Brothers, Black Sabbath, Tina Turner, and a few others. So they had some, I guess, regional success.